Guys, can you see my screen? Yeah, good. Okay, so I said today we'd look at a little bit more about specifying printing work in particular. We'd look at the Australian standard. I think it's useful to have a read through it carefully, and you'll pick up things in it that I haven't seen before, and likewise, I'm sure I picked things that you haven't. And like anything, it's an old standard. It's got a long history. It's a standard that's quite dear to me. Back in the days when I used to prune, it was one of those things that I was so glad to see come in. Some of you younger fellows like Owen might not recall, but we used to do a thing called balance pruning was one of the things that would get specified, or prune tree by 1/3, and there was an illustration with 1/3 of the height of the tree cut off. So big changes have occurred in the last 20 or so years as a result of the Australian standard for tree pruning. So again, the standards are things that I support, but like everything, I support constant improvement. And I know the Australian standard for protection of trees on development site has been put up for improvement. Case for change is being prepared. I believe it will be finally submitted on Wednesday, so the documents have been prepared for it all. We've got some industry support, and it's one that's going to be changing. And likewise, the pruning standard is changing. There's going to be a section either added to the standard or a second standard done that looks at what we now call environmental pruning, or those sort of pruning techniques that don't fit in with the very formalized things like fracture pruning. And there's good reasons to do that. Things like fracture pruning, something that I definitely support as a process. Everyone know what fracture pruning is? Owen, yeah, I think so. You aware what fracture pruning is? Just grabbing the branch, breaking it where it breaks off. That's where it was meant to be removed at this point in time. And there's really good reasons for doing that. Not the least is we alter the ecology of fungi, for example, with simply doing very formal pruning. And there are times when very formal pruning is great and the way to go. There are times when informalized or some of these environmental pruning techniques are occurring. So first of all, I thought I'd talk to you about a printing spec that I said I would provide for you. So I'll pull that up. And you realize how bad things are. Just simply things change. So first of all, I have to confess that I've redacted the report. So you can't see anything else except that it was first done in 2012. I'll also tell you that I spent 15 minutes editing out mistakes. And that's 2 pages. So that gives you an idea of things that will happen. I just thought I'd share one of them with you so you can realize that, again, these things happen and why you need to have somebody else read your report. So far, you know, there's some issues there, past tense. Okay, you could improve the quality of the communication. This is one of those horrible things that we've now done and improved quite a bit. But I thought this was important here. It's important to understand that the standard specifies that a branch must be cut back to a fork of a suitable size, not less than 1/3 the size of the branch being removed. As a result, cats cannot be made to the fence line. And that's exactly what it says, cats. I'll zoom in and let you see that so you know that. There it is, highlighted for you. That went out. The client already knows that they've got no cats on their fence line now. And how does that happen? Well, it happens because when we're reading, our brain automatically corrects that for us. You might have seen,
your client probably did exactly the same thing, looked at it and thought, oh, yeah, I know he means cuts.
Yes, and may not have even realized it said cats instead of cuts. And I had one in my thing down here, it says risk of harm. I had the risk of ham. I'm wondering if it's in there. Let me just see. Control F find HAM. No, not in there. So, but I had the risk of ham in a document in the standard template for about 3 or 4 years. without
I
seeing.
think I've discussed the risk of ham myself a few times, Mark.
It's hard not to do, and it's one of the advantages of coming back. And again, if you're using Word, I don't know whether you are or not, but if you are, great. This might help you understand. When you open Word, you don't have to open Word directly and go to your document. One of the things you can do is right-click, and it'll give you a list of recent documents you've been working with, and that's sometimes a very quick way to get there. You can also pin documents to the top. So, for example, I have some timesheets there for a job I was doing for a TAFE. I've got Mark's chess golden rules, so I'm learning to play chess better, and I've got these golden rules that I've got to remember, so I make the edits there. And I have my auto inserts. The things that I often insert into my documents is saved there as a spot so I can get to it quickly. But I thought I'd just show you again that typically once a week I do a development site report. It's about an average. And this is one that I'm working on at the moment. And I'll zoom to the spot and you'll see there's a green there, and we highlight green in my office. It means when somebody's doing the proofreading, they need to change the template. Far too many plans, but there's a change to the template. Wow, another change to the template. This is a document I use and tweak on a regular basis. This here, it had a capital R and a capital R, and I just hate capitals for every word in a subheading. I just don't think it's necessary. And again, if I keep going through here, it's far more wordy than these. There's another one. Look at that. Another change to the template. Another change to the template. So this is not
I don't want to say
one-off thing.
because they can be identified in the
Somebody's
morning.
got a
Have to do that one day.
audio going.
Been bed all night.
Yeah, and usually she does. She's usually a good girl.
Somebody's talking to a child.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you just need to go on a mute. That's all. So yes, again, more template changes. And here's another little helpful hint. Doesn't matter what system you're using. This here, because I'm working on the document, it's not finalized. It'll go back to my editing team with that highlight. And that says, make sure that you've adjusted this appropriately. That should now be 23 because another condition's been put in. And likewise here, 14 refers back up to item 14, and it's correct. So that just helps check things that change when you're referring to a previous item. So again, always editing. It doesn't matter how many times I've done it. And I'll just make a quick note there very quickly. Irrigation, because I just realized it needs a clause in this one for irrigation. It's a unusual document in that regard. File. Save. I don't have a standard insert for that. So again, getting your templates right is important. So, you know, how do we specify pruning? It's difficult. And this is a more formalized one that I did to get past a council's requirement. The council wanted everything specified in accordance with the standard. So undertake crown modification as per 7.3, where it's bolded, it refers to the standard. By removing up to 10% of the crown, 3.12 of any tree that overhangs the boundary by reducing, and then reducing is defined in 7.3.2 and so on. I'm not going to go right through it. I'll leave it up there for a minute or so that you can go back to the video and have a look at it. But I guess the question is, how formal do we need to be? And I've just been listening to a keynote speaker at New Zealand ARB's conference in November this year in Wellington, giving a talk on TED about being a badass writer. And I think her comments are very true, that often in this formalization of things, we make it more convoluted, longer, and some ways don't communicate effectively. And I think we've got to watch for that, remembering that the purpose of writing reports is to communicate. So there's got to be a line between the two. And as I said last time, I showed you a less formalized process, and wherever possible, I would rather it be as simple as possible, as short as possible, and concise as possible, rather than being complex. Again, those of you who use Word, if you decide that you want a double space or single space, and you use Grammarly, Grammarly will allow you to adjust to single space or double space. And I do support the use of Grammarly, as you know. Let me just push this over this side, open Grammarly. You'll see that Grammarly, again, as I open it up, and it should allow me to go through it, will again try and help soften things down. Should you feel that, if you feel just 3 words versus 5 words, say the same thing and say it less formally. So is there a time when you need to be formal? I think so. I think there are some situations where formality is expected, but in most cases, I think the comment is true that we should write more in line with the way we speak normally than in formalized technical writing. We write technical reports because that's what is expected of us, not necessarily because it's the best process of communication. And as I've said previously, and we'll look at it in detail in one of our wars, if you're writing to a court outside of the Land Environment Court, at least in New South Wales, I'd always encourage you to write formally, but write first person as though you're writing to the judge, the reader. You're communicating with a reader. You want to tell them a story. You don't want to make it complex. And I think we have a habit of doing that as arborists. So yes, I went through here with Grammarly, and even though I've gone through with Grammarly, this is a quote from the council's thing, so never change or edit a quote. That's not appropriate. And here, if I went like this now and just put a 1 space and using Grammarly, it does allow you to go back and it will come up all of a sudden. It'll say, yes, here it is. What do you want to do here? 1 space or 2. I just want everything to go update all to 1 space or update to 2 spaces. So that's a really neat little trick that you can do with Grammarly if you want. And Peter, you haven't been able to get it to work with the software that you're using at this stage, or can you, Grammarly?
No, it doesn't work with the program that I use, but it does work on my emails and some of the other stuff like that. So I do use it, and I've got a feel for what it likes to do. And for me, I think that the assistance that I do have in the program that I use works well enough for me.
Yeah, look, and again, you'd have to think about the target audience. I was, you saw I was doing some work for one of the TAFEs in Melbourne and writing some teaching material, and I thought, who am I writing to? I'm writing to a diploma student. What level of language do I need to be using? How do I communicate? Is that clear enough? If I was writing the same document for a level 2 ARB student, I'd have to assume that some of those might not read so well. Some of them might not have the same grasp of English, and I would need to simplify my sentences more. And I would go to something like AutoCrit or something like that. There are, again, software that allows you to simplify or look at how to simplify your documents. You know, words that I put into my English vocab that are standard words for me to use might be entirely inappropriate. And jargon is something that we use as arborists all the time. It's very hard not to use it. And, you know, part of that jargon, for example, is scientific tree names. And Peter, what's the best tree name for any tree?
Tree number 1 or tree number 5?
Everyone understands that. Not everyone understands, you know.
Except I appreciate what you're saying there, Mark, but I read other Arborist reports, and so I get to criticise them in my mind. And one of the things that I find that I don't like about the reports is where they go through and they identify the trees and so on, and then they start talking about them later on. But you haven't been on site. You don't know these trees, you know, by name. I aren't familiar with them. And I find that the use of the numbers is difficult, because then you've got to, if you want to understand which one tree 12 is, you've actually got to go back and search through the report and find some reference to it, maybe on a plan or something. And then you've got the description of the trees in the in the table of tree descriptions lurking around somewhere. And then you've got, I prefer to use the common name.
Yeah, look, exactly. There are things you can do to improve that. Exactly. And it might be when you're talking about a particular tree, you might, and again, let me pull it up so you can see. I'll give you an example. And again, it can be a problem for us because we can have multiple trees of the same species and genus. That's not uncommon. We can have same species, different genus, just to get complex. Too many plants in the site. But you can see here, I've used common names, the tallow woods.
And if there are multiples, then I will describe them as tree number 5 tallow wood, or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, perfectly fine to do. And again,
I specifically, I've decided to use the common names because of the target audience. And again, reading other reports where they stick to the scientific names, unless I'm actually familiar with them, then it's that thing of I've got to go and look it up each time. And where I'm writing to a target audience that's not familiar with the scientific names, I know that they're not, then it's just makes life a lot easier for everybody, I think, to talk about the tree number and its common name. And I've got in the report what the scientific name is if they want to know it. But
absolutely, so that's exactly what. And there are times when, for example, I want to talk about the gap between two trees here, from tree 1, and so I've had to actually use their numbers. There's no point, trying to describe those. So I could say the northern, the middle, the southern. Once you get more than 3, it gets really complex. But by all means, a common name is perfectly acceptable. And one of the things that can be useful in using the common name, and sometimes, and I'll pull up a second one. No, I won't, not quickly. That a common name and the tree number. So if there was one cypress here, I might have said the cypress tree, and I would put tree number 2 in brackets afterwards, so that they can go and see exactly where it is on the plan if they want to, or if they've got the plan printed off, they can see that beside them. So, but I won't go through and put Eucalyptus microcories every single time I write about that tree. I think that's just too hard for a reader to read. And I think that gets to that almost jargonistic point. Oftentimes in a simple 1 tree report, it'll be the tree, and it needs to be nothing else more than the tree. So yeah, I agree with you, Peter, totally. Again, the purpose is to do what? Owen? I'll make sure he's there with us. Everyone else has got their mic off. I'll find out who else is around.
It's going to be easy for the reader to understand. So.
Yeah, I want to communicate with the reader.
Yeah.
If I can communicate so they don't misunderstand, we're done. If I can do that simply, easily, and quickly, I'm an expert. I'm not there yet. I'm working towards that as a goal, but I'm still got more to go. Susan Stratton has asked, is the free Grammarly or the subscription? I use a subscription one, Susan. I've used it now for about 6 or 7 years. It's just standard in our office. It makes life so much easier because you've got someone else essentially assisting you in the editing process. And it makes a huge difference. Now, if you've got a good formal background with good English skills, Louise Bennett, for example, who's an English major, great. She probably wouldn't even think about Grammarly. But the average tree guy who's writing reports, who's come from the trade, somebody like myself, you know, there was a stage there where I could walk erect and drag my knuckles about a metre behind on the ground. You know, I'm not the best educated. And, you know, English is a different skill than maths and science. It really is. And communicating scientific stuff through English is extremely difficult. And I think we all know that. We've all read reports, and boy, we've all read Arborist reports where you think, I can't read this. This is hurting. Has everyone read something like that as an Arborist report?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I know I write like that, Peter, so I've got to watch it. Got to really work to dumb it down and make sure, not dumb it down in terms of, I don't need to have a 5-line sentence.
Simplify, I think, is possibly what you're looking for, Mark.
Yeah, I think that's a good word, Peter. So cost of it, I think it's about $130 or $140 a year to subscribe to Grammarly. So it would be, in my mind, the best writing tool. There is other software around. I think the algorithm for Ginger is probably better, but it doesn't interface with Word as easily. And Grammarly, you can cut and paste documents into it on the website, and it'll give you some basic review back. But yes, I couldn't imagine writing reports. If I was doing 5 reports a year, I would have Grammarly. It's as simple as that. You know, what would that work out to be for a report? Less than $14 a report. I think that's a fair deal. So thanks for that question, Susan. Okay. So next thing I said we'd do is have a look at the Australian standards. So I've got a copy of it, AS 4373. Committee is EV018. Boy, am I familiar with that now. And first of all, I want you to look at the people that are represented in that committee for this standard. It's changed. You know, it depends on the makeup, and there'll be people, but the Australian College of Council of National Trusts, that's good. National Trust, by the way, was set up originally to protect heritage trees, and they got stuck on buildings, and I don't think they know what a heritage tree is in general. If you're listening from National Trust, get your act together. The Australian Institute of Building Surveyors, very important when it comes to pruning trees. The Australian Institute of Horticulture, well, I can see why they're involved. And the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, Susan might explain why they're involved. Australian Local Government Association, yep, I get why they're there. The Australian Pipeline Industry Association, that's getting a little obscure. Australian Property Institute, okay. Energy Networks Association, you get why Ina's there. Institute of Australian Consulting Arboriculturists, get why they're there. International Society of Arboriculture, Local Government Tree Resource Association, National Arborist Association of Australia, Nursery and Garden Industry Association, TAFE New South Wales, University of Melbourne, and Water Services Association of Australia. Again, I'm not sure why Water Services Association of Australia is there. I do understand TAFE and the universities, but again, I think they're more, it should be more about communicating. Then QAA, Queensland Arboricultural Association, and North Melbourne Institute of TAFE. Again, educational institutions do have a rightful role, because apart from anything else, they're going to be checking accuracy and making sure that we're communicating. Although I got to say, I wouldn't necessarily bet my bottom dollar on academic institutions always being right. Would that be a fair comment, Peter?
I agree with that.
Good. Yes, so you know, we're constantly learning and growing, and some of our industry representatives have been very active. A preface, there's you know, important stuff there, but it's not that critical. It's not going to change anything what's going on. We've got a scope, a forward, and just the bottom bit there is highlighted for a reason. That's for me to discuss it with you. Detailed guidelines on root pruning are beyond the scope of the standard. However, general outline is included. Should the need arise, expert guidance should be obtained regarding root pruning and excavation around and near trees. That's interesting.
Yeah, where do we find an expert, Mark?
Yeah, Peter, I'm hoping to find one because I keep on getting told I'm not one. It is a difficult thing. Yes. Here's some hints on pruning roots that are worthwhile discussing in the standard. I think they should be there. The roots need to be severed. That's probably good. Cleanly cut, I'm not so sure. And Peter is more positive than
I've actually done some research on that, although I haven't had it published, it clearly shows that for roots up to 100 mil diameter, it's much better to break them off in terms of the growth response of the tree ensuing.
And that does seem to make some sense, certainly from the cut end. It may, I'm not sure what it'll do further back, and of course that would take a lot more.
It seems to me that the cracks that form where you break a root stimulate the root to grow new roots, whereas if you cut cleanly, then you don't have that stimulus, and you've only got just the very end, where the roots are stimulated from.
I'd agree with you, Peter, as you know.
Am I on mute?
No, you're not on mute. Who asked that, Rob?
Yeah, just about breaking a root. It's all very well to say break it off, but how do you actually physically do that?
With an earth moving equipment.
Oh yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah.
So if you're on a construction site, or if you're doing a transplant, it's really nice not to have to sit there, dig around, cut, break it off. And then, the question is, then do you need to trim back? And the suggestion is probably not. If a branch broke in a tree, the only reason we prune it back is because we have to deal with gravity. But underground, there's no such thing as gravity that we have to worry about. So, the principles that apply to above ground pruning and below ground pruning aren't quite the same. Likewise, we don't need to cut to a fork. You simply cut to wherever you need to cut. Obviously, clean equipment is important. Some diseases can be spread by pruning, but then I would say the same principle is true for above ground. I really would like arborists to get to the stage where they start just periodically sterilizing their equipment. And that's just done with alcohol and water. 70% methylated spirits, that's alcohol. We just methylate it to stop you from drinking it. So methylated spirits and water will do the job. So, but yeah, it's interesting that's there in the forward, which I think is lovely. There's no discussion of consulting arborists. And I understand, in fairness, when this was established as a standard, there was no such thing as a consulting arborist. And in reality, most pruning specifications should be able to be developed by a AQF level 3 arborist for good reason. Why is that?
Well, they're doing it.
Yeah, they're the guys that are going to be doing the work. There are some times when they probably shouldn't be doing it, maybe in some heritage trees and things like that, but they should have a basic understanding of the physiology and the anatomy behind that process. But yes, there's no discussion here of consulting arborists and their role. I would say it was an important tree, then it makes sense to write specifications in that situation. So lots of terms defined, which is really great. Considerations before pruning. We need to start thinking about what sort of pruning we're going to be doing, how is it going to affect it, and the standards divided them up for us. The standard also tells us whether it should make reference to any relevant legislation, and depending on where you are in the country or the world, that's going to vary considerably. Interesting here, tree work is inherently hazardous and should be carried out by a person suitably qualified and experienced in arboriculture. Minimum of AQF level 2 in arboriculture work should be performed in accordance with the relevant OH&S guidelines. Persons carrying out the assessment should have a minimum qualification of AQF level 3 in arboriculture. And there's a point to which that does then refer back to a consulting arborist, even though it's not referred to in the standard. I'm not sure that I'd want an AQF level 2 arborist doing pruning work unsupervised, though. What do people feel?
I thought the acceptable run-of-the-mill was level 3 for pruning.
I would feel a lot more happier. I don't mind a level 2 person doing it, provided they're under the supervision. So I would put performed by or under the direct supervision of. And that's what I shared with you in the last meeting of war in my current pruning specifications. So things that can damage the bark is discussed here. So we've got spurs, spikes, hooks, they're all the same thing. Chain platforms, boy, I've got some of those. If anyone wants some platforms, I've still got some. Lowering systems. What's a lowering system?
A rope.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's there. And if any of you have ever lowered or even just climbed, climb something with a thin bark like a ace and a gundo, maybe Rob's weight, you might get away with it. Michele, your weight, I'm sorry, my weight. I'm going to braid through the fork if I go up and down a couple of times. So I'm going to do damage to the bark. Again, where there is risk of spread of disease from one tree to another, pruning tools shall be disinfected between trees. It doesn't tell you how that's to be done. There are a number of ways. Those of you who are comfortable with it, bleach does a reasonably good job. Polyphenols, which is household disinfectants, do a reasonably good job. Alcohol, in my mind, just beats the lot. And the reason you add 30% water in is to stop it going woof. That's it. Just makes it less combustible. You want to ask a question, Owen?
Yeah, I was just going to say there's, I don't know if it's still up there, but I did find some good stuff on cleaning tools and disinfecting on Linda Chalker Scott's website. She had a good list of myths, like she's basically myth busting certain stuff, but there was some quite good information up there.
And is she discontented with alcohol as a?
No, basically alcohol was the best one, she sort of said. And the same as you just said, a sort of a 10-to-1 mix of, I believe it was a 10-to-1 mix of household bleach would be effective, but she sort of preferenced the alcohol. So
Yeah, look, if you put it on a chainsaw chain.
Is bleach corrosive?
Sorry?
Is bleach corrosive?
Yeah. It's just you put it on your chainsaw bar, it stuffs it up. Whereas you put methylated spirits on and it just does the job neatly for you. It's just such a neat thing. Once spray it on, let it dry, it's done. And typically the conditions that I would see us doing that more in is hedging and foliage disease, and particularly with Ceridium canker and hedging of cypress. It can be a real problem. It's the most common place. We do it with transplanting because the risk of Phytophthora is a reasonable risk. And that's just because it's a ubiquitous disease that was spread through urban areas. So lots of nice little bits and pieces. So here we come to our first illustration, and I think that it's important to have these communicated well. These, by the way, this is a branch bark ridge, and we all know what that is. There's been some discussion in one publication of a stem bark ridge or a trunk bark ridge, and I'm not so sure that exists. So if you've got a codominant stem, you don't get this little moustache being built up here. So if someone can find me one to the contrary, that would be great, but codominant stems don't have this little ridging structure on it. So how do I want to cut? Well, I want to cut as illustrated in A in the standard. The final cut. Boy, I want to push that further out now, Peter. I don't know about you.
Yeah,
But-
I wouldn't mind seeing it go out a bit to the outside of the collar. Seems to be right through the collar.
Yeah. I think the collars probably, depending on the species, could be out here. And collars can be incredibly long. Has everyone seen a branch collar that's more than 1 meter long?
A white beech branch collar is absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, look, I'm pretty sure I can pull up very quickly. No, an illustration of how big they can become. If my search engine works well for me. It may not, because branch and collar may not want to do together. Oh yeah, we've got, well, here's just a small branch. You can see where the branch collar is. Quite a way out. If I go back, here's a branch collar that's enormous. There's an Angophora costata. So branch collars can be quite long. That is horrible cutting, isn't it? Oh, and goodness, the saw's not running. Yeah, here's that same thing on another. You know, this is just waiting to rest on a car or a truck that's coming behind. They're long collars, and the answer is you don't cut them off. So when I first started, my boss.
Well, you might cut into them, Mark, if you're interested in fast tracking a hollow in the tree.
Yeah, okay. If the aim is not to cause some secondary issues, leave the collar. So yes, the temptation now would be to push that out to you know, perhaps somewhere along that line there. I think we're probably in too close. And you all know how to tell whether the cut's good by where the wound wood develops. If the cut is good, you'll get wound wood all the way around nice and evenly. If the cut is bad, you'll get sections where the wound wood doesn't develop, top or bottom. So you can go back and examine from your final cuts as to whether you've got it right. So this thing here, the stem bark ridge, I'm still to find one, but it's there. I'm just not sure that it actually exists. One of those will be a branch and the other one will be the stem. Co-dominant stems don't have that lifted structure. They have a different way of joining themselves and dealing with tissue. And included junctions definitely don't have that. So our pruning
What
club.
about fracture pruning, Mark?
I love fracture pruning, but it's not in the standard. Fracture pruning, grab the dead branch. I think it's only, well, it's not only suitable for dead branches, but I like it on dead branches. You know, and one of the great things I like about it for dead branches is it'll help inform your view of risk. The number of people that say to me, oh, but it's got a dead branch. And you say, okay, let's just try breaking that off with a throw line. And you throw your throw line over, or if you're like me, you have to shoot it over nowadays because I'm getting old. And you put your throw line on and you say, each strand of that, so it's good for 100 kilos. We can get 200 kilos of pull. Let's tie a big branch onto it, you know, dead stub, and let's give it a big haul. And the number of times that it doesn't break off is embarrassing. You know, fracture pruning works because you can get up, you can get about a third of the way in from the end and give it a good yank. And even then, people that do it will tell you that there are times when they say, oh, well, I need to go out a little bit more and break. There's certainly times when you can break it off perfectly, but unless you realize that dead branches are a lot more secure than we often give them credit for. And they can, you know, on some things like quercus, they can take decades for a branch to, you know, a 100 mm branch to become unstable. So we have two basic types of pruning work. We have crown maintenance and crown modification. Crown maintenance is what Shigo used to refer to as giving the tree a shower, getting it clean. I'm not sure, again, that those terms are probably as acceptable today as they were when he used to give his lectures, but we're still there. So deadwooding, and you already know my view on that. Deadwooding is a nice cliched term. It's jargon. What are we saying when we're saying deadwooding?
Pruning out dead branches.
Yeah, removing dead branches, dead branch removal. Deadwooding implies that we're going to go down the middle of the trunk and sit there with a big auger and hollow it all out and take out all the dead wood. You know, so what does it mean? We're really saying removing dead branches, and we've used that term deadwooding to the point that we don't even see that it's jargon, but it is. And there it is, sitting bang smack in the standard. Crown thinning. Now, crown thinning is a second type of crown maintenance, and I think it's probably closer to crown modification than it is crown maintenance. And there are some trees that will tolerate thinning and respond well, that don't have issues with it. In most cases, I think it's a almost redundant process. One of the advantages of crown thinning is to encourage internal growth and growth below. And that's something that if you're doing reduction pruning can be very useful. If you go to Stanford University in California, they've got some Pitoshma undulatum that they've been keeping at a fixed height by simply doing exactly that, thinning them out, letting light come in, letting new shoots develop. As new shoots develop, they thin back down to those new shoots, and you can keep the tree compact. If you get to go to New Zealand, you can track down an arborist called Gary Claxton. His reduction pruning on a jacaranda that would otherwise have obstructed his view of Auckland Harbour is brilliant. The tree's been reduced probably 25 times, and you could barely notice it, except that it's not the normal jacaranda form. It's been kept compact. Selective pruning, that's simply, you know, cutting out the odd thing. You know, might be I don't know, a branch that's just growing towards the power lines or something like that. And formative pruning. Now, formative pruning is really great, really important. And I was down at Hyde Park, and I'm not sure who was handling the contract. I know it was one of my students. And instead of removing the lower wall of branches, they reduced the lower wall of branches, what we call pruning to redundancy, or making the branch become less functional, but still doing a job. The less you take out in formative pruning, in many ways, the better. So if you've got a codominant stem, you don't have to remove the entire thing. You can remove part of it at this stage, part of it the next one. These changes to the canopy are best done in 2 or 3 things. And again, whilst it's down there as crown maintenance, it is actually crown modification. I don't know how it got in there. Isn't that fascinating? It's just the way we were thinking at the time. So true crown modification, crown reduction pruning. Reduction pruning, for some reason, has picked up some bad publicity. And that's because it's closely related to lopping, I guess, but it's not. No more than pollarding is the same as lopping. So reduction pruning is really valuable. The question is, what can't you reduction prune? Anyone?
A palm tree?
Oh, I love it. Yeah, some monocots will not tolerate reduction pruning, particularly monomeristematic plants, because when you remove the apical,
Conifers, Don, you got to be careful
you've got to be careful.
with conifers and reduction pruning, because
Yeah, go on.
yeah, they don't really shoot. They don't have the epicormic growth as angiosperms.
So some don't. You're right. Some don't have these meristematic traces that are long-lived. So Cupressus sempervirens or Cupressus apparus, or is now Cupressus cross lawsoniana this month. Goodness knows what it'll be next month. I think it's had 7 or 8 name changes in in the last 6 years. I mean, it just drives me crazy. Because of course we were questioning whether it should have been Hesperus arborus as well, and there's all that argument about it. But yeah, they don't have long-lasting meristematic traces. So if you cut them back, then the inside there is going to be hollow, and they have to have new branches grow up. But one of the advantages that conifers have in reduction pruning is they develop strength from below the branch, and that's really important. So they develop this stuff called compression wood, and so they really don't need the top at all for strength. Having said that, angiosperms do much the same, which is really fascinating. But conifers have just mastered it so well. So you can take the top out of an Arboricurium. I'm not suggesting you should. Pick your whirl, take the top out, and I've been and seen one that has just one wall of branches, and that's it. And a massive trunk. Just every year, as new branches grow back up into the wires, they cut it back, and it does perfectly fine with that. And I showed you, I know for, I'm pretty sure, the tortured forest of Poland, you know, where they push back up. So conifers are fairly good. Where there's no internal foliage, where we strip it out, and that's one of the problems of this crown thinning when it's done badly. Crown thinning is done well, it should remove foliage from the end of the canopy, so bits in. That's what crown thinning should do. It's not removal of the internal foliage, that's lines tailing. And they've been working at doing a good job of it of late, but Hyde Park in Sydney is a good example of a place where a lot of the internal foliage has been removed, and then it's, you know, you've got an outer canopy that might only be 1 metre or 1.5 metres long. There's not a lot of spots to reduce it to. So ideally you want some internal canopy to do it, or you have to make that internal canopy. And the way to make that, as I said, is to thin it out. And by thinning, I mean taking stuff that goes all the way to the outside edges. If you're working on a tree and you want to thin it, you need to walk past branches. If you're not walking past branches as you're going out, you're not thinning, okay? It's just the only way you can do it is to get to the outside. So reduction pruning, I think, is great. You can certainly do reduction pruning on eucalypts, and I'm becoming more and more impressed with some of the arborists out there. They're getting it right now and starting to get the technique down to a fine process. You can do reduction pruning on ficus and ficus microcarpellii. Peter, I think you went out with us, the ones at Alstonville Primary School. Reduction prune from a man box on a crane. Thank goodness we can use a rope and
I was involved with that, Mark, but not in the pruning stage.
But you did see the end results of that, and I think,
yes, I think I did. Yeah,
yeah,
they're still there. Those trees are still there.
yeah, and nobody's dead yet from them. I mean, this is this view that we have, that we get really worried about risk. So that's reduction pruning, and I think it's a very important tool. It's not a tool that I think you want to do to every.
One thing that surprised me about the reduction pruning was the effect of the effect of the pruning. So I was surprised at how little you need to take off to achieve a big reduction in the load force.
Absolutely, that's right. And we know that to be the case because when we put out our arm and we hold something, we know that that gets heavy very quickly. Just bring it in a little bit makes a huge change in that process. So you're getting a double whammy. You're reducing the physical load, and then you're reducing the wind load that comes from that extension. So
there seems to be, I don't know if this is true or not, but it seems to me that there's this feeling out there that to get a third reduction in the loading on the branch, it's a good idea to chop a third of the branch off.
yeah, it's a misnomer, Peter, absolutely. So to get a reduction in the load by 1/3, you might only need to take 10% out. So, you know, significantly less. This concept of, because you're doing the two things, you're reducing mass and then you're reducing load on the lever. If the lever is 10% shorter, you've automatically reduced the mass back on the fork, and you've reduced the wind loading back on that fork. So you're absolutely right. Huge gains can become fairly early. Someone's got some chat questions, and I've just seen them. Let me just quickly go over those. Peter, can you hurry up and get your article out there? No pressure. Yes, Susan. Peter and I have made a commitment to do that before the.
As soon as I can get Mark to review my report, that'll be another step forward.
We're going to do it as an article in Arbor Age for you, and we'll let you know when that's coming out. Luke says, hi to everybody. I just want to say I feel tree numbers and reports are important as they provide reference to the provider map or plan. Absolutely. The numbers are important. And where there's confusion, remember the purpose, Luke, of a report is to communicate so that we can be not misunderstood. And so if I'm talking about 3 tallow woods and it's important that I talk about one specifically, that's where tree number comes in. If I'm talking about the tallow woods generally on the site, I don't even have to worry if I'm talking about the trees on the site generally. So the site I just had up, all the trees within the property boundary are fruit trees. You know, it's easy. I can say generally about things, so that you don't need to even do anything more than be generalized in that position. Yes, I think you should definitely outline. So Luke says, I feel reports should explain why the pruning is required. So what are you trying to achieve is one of the things that the standard asks us to determine and communicate. Why are we doing this pruning work? Is it to get the scaffold passed, and that's commonplace? Is it to, you know, if you're old, Rob, you and I are we're over 50. It was to reduce risk was the big argument. Well, I would say if we were pruning today to reduce risk, that would be a pretty poor reason to prune. So, yeah.
Would you make an argument, Mark, that the more you act on a tree, the more damage you can cause, as well as because you can open up the canopy and allow wind to get into it and break things during a storm, or not?
Yes, there is. And look, it's not ever been, as far as I know, it's not ever been well modeled. But so we could be entirely wrong on the hypothesis, but the hypothesis is this.
Didn't Ken James do some work on that, Mark?
Well, actually, Ed Gilman did. Ed Gilman got a massive big wind machine and tested thinning and reduction pruning and its impact on trees and tree stability. And as you can imagine, the greatest effect came from reduction pruning and not thinning. And he was able to show that in the longer term, thinning didn't have as much benefit. Then Matt Wells did some wonderful work out of Santa Monica, and he was able to show that the trees that they more frequently pruned were the trees that more frequently failed. That is, failure happened in spite of pruning. I'm not saying it happened because of, although I suggest that, and again, Americans that hear this and see this, don't crucify me, but the quality of pruning work in Santa Monica is beautiful if you like what they call lace pruning. We have a more technical name for it. We call it lines tailing. It's just absolutely over manicured. But who here does fishing? Anyone? Yeah, okay, Michele. If I've got a fishing rod and I think, well, I'm going to go out and catch some big fish today, so I'm just going to strap a big piece of really stiff bamboo and I'm going to gaff tape it all the way up to a meter from the, or half a meter from the end, and I go out fishing, what's likely to happen?
That thing's going to snap.
It's going to snap at the end. We know that it works because we do exactly the same thing with staking. And if you haven't ever seen it and you want to see it, send Peter an email and I'll send you, I won't send you, I'll show the group pictures of staking of trees in Santa Monica, in Wynn, Las Vegas, in the tips group. and I'll show you where they put a stake up and then the next stake up and the next stake up. And they keep on strapping the stakes as they go up the tree. And then when they no longer strap them, the tops break off. So hence the hypothesis, Michele, that the average size of your pruning cut is what's likely to fail until the tree fixes things up after we've been messing with it. So the best thing you can do is keep your cuts small. Another good reason to make small reduction cuts rather than big cuts. Another good reason to make small thinning cuts, that is move out rather than cut one branch at the trunk. So, and the reason that is when you're doing smaller cuts, the lower stuff becomes stiffer because you're taking stuff away. You know that if you go get a big, a good sapling, saplings are more flexible, and you go start to bend it, you've probably done it at some stage or other. Owen, I can see, is going to say yes in a second, where you hear that go crack and you think, oh, almost done it. And so you say to a mate, come and give me a hand. And you get 2 or 3 more people in, and you actually bring it down a long way by applying the load more evenly along it. So when we alter the loading to a tree, we have an impact. And absolutely, Ken James has done work on what happens when we convert things more to a mass damping and a static and dynamic load, how they compare. We're certainly better off trying to prune and take a minimum out, but there are going to be times when we certainly need to. Pollarding, sorry, crown lifting. Crown lifting, the reason why you crown lift.
You might want to get some clearance for pedestrians or mowers or something.
Yeah, clearance for machinery, vehicles, those sort of things. That's a really good reason to do some canopy raising. Sunlight. Number of people that say to me, thin the tree, I want light. You get all the light you need during summer. When don't you get all the light you need?
In winter.
Winter. And if you're talking about winter, you want the sun to come in as early as possible. And that's achieved not by doing anything up the top at all, but simply by raising the canopy. So sunlight is another reason to raise the canopy. And if you're talking about a light into a building, raising on the side furthest away from the building is the critical side, not the side closest. So crown lifting, how about crown lifting over buildings?
Yep.
Yep, Rob.
Yeah, sure. It's often a good idea to stop the branches banging on the roof.
Yeah, stop things abrading on the roof. Exactly. How about raising it up 8 meters because I want less leaves in my gutter?
Well, that's not going to work.
Yeah, it's not going to work. I get leaves in the gutter of my office here, and the nearest tree, unfortunately, to the office is be 12 meters to the south. Where do those leaves come from? The answer is you watch a leaf in the wind and it just simply floats, it's got aerodynamic qualities to it. So it moves a long way. So raising the canopy upwards by any more than you need to over a building, in my mind, is foolhardy. How about the problem with block gutters? The answer is that's definitely a gutter issue. It needs to be resolved, figure out the gutter issues and be done with it. Okay, so that's crown lifting. So it's mostly associated with line of sight. So if you're talking about, pulling out driveways, for example, being able to see traffic or see pedestrians, those sort of situations, experience for vehicles as they move along.
This is probably, not something that the standard looks at, but there's a lot of pruning done for clearance of electrical infrastructure, railway lines, and for bushfire these days.
Absolutely, and that's important work to do. And again, no issues with that. What I do want you to have a look at is with all of these things and reduction pruning, we didn't discuss it. There's this R, and this is pruning class is restricted to trees with a suitable secondary branches. Now, you'll have to excuse me, guys. If I go up to the definitions, because we've just used a nice term there. What is a secondary branch?
Sorry.
I don't know what a secondary branch is. What's a secondary branch? Interesting. This is how jargonistic we become. I think what it's saying is
Second order.
with a branch that you can't cut to that has 1/3 the diameter of the cut you're making. That's the definition of a reduction cut. The diameter of the cut should be no bigger than 3 times the residual side branch that you're leaving.
Yeah, so Mark, I thought it was more dealing with, say, first, second order or third or fourth order branches.
No, because every tree has second and third order branches, just how far out they are.
Yeah,
Yeah, so it's again, it's how we use words so that we are not misunderstood. This is just one that is not, doesn't have the clarity that it should have. I mean, it may mean that. I'm just not sure that it means that. That's all. So crown lifting, we can do that to all trees. Pollarding. Pollarding is a process of cutting back to the same spot every year. And you can do this obviously with deciduous trees. And pruning class is applicable only to trees in the formerly pruned to achieve the required results. So we're talking about young trees, but I'm wondering whether you could do it to other trees as well. What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, if you are prepared to spend the time on allowing the pollards to form, I don't see why not.
So could you do a pollard on a eucalypt? That's what I want to know.
There's a lot of eucalyptus species that can handle pollarding.
I agree with you, Michele. And it's again, it's this mindset that we've got in Australia. It's about timing and it's about dose. So yeah, now I'm not saying go out and create a eucalyptus pollard of every tree, please. Not what I'm suggesting, but I'm suggesting that there are times when things that we don't think of as pollards, evergreens, are quite acceptable to pollard. They really are easy if it's a deciduous tree. It's a little bit harder if it's an evergreen, a fair bit harder if it's an evergreen.
yeah, you actually see that with the Fostermans when they're pruning them under power lines.
Yeah. Who was that?
Through the coats. Yeah.
Is that?
I've done it with lily pillies in gardens quite successfully.
Yeah, I'll do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just a question of understanding the physiology and the anatomy of the plant. Why do we pollard the way we do? The answer is if we keep on cutting the new shoots off and don't go back into the old tissue, we control decay to the inside. And a good pollard is just an amazing looking thing. Great architecturally, great in terms of statements. Again, I'm not suggesting we pollard every tree at all, but there's a place and a time for it. And certainly in terms of some of our older trees, retaining old pollards does have a spot. A couple of years ago, I was over in the UK and Mike Ellison took us out to see some 200- and 300-year-old pollards. And a number of those have been let to go. And even then, there were still good trees. So then remedial or restorative pruning is the stuff that you do after a failure or after a storm, predominantly after storms. And really it's carried out on damaged, declining or diseased trees. So this is our retrenchment pruning or our natural retrenchment pruning or repairing of a tree that's been damaged. Now, it's always one that has caused me concerns because if I can do restorative pruning to a tree, then I can do restorative pruning to that tree at any stage of reality. If I can make it survive, then I can make it survive. And the line clearance, and it's there. It's the evil that needs to happen. And I say it's the evil that needs to happen, not in a negative sense, but, you know, we definitely do need to ensure that we minimize things like bushfires that are caused by trees or outages, service outages that are caused by trees. And so the requirements there are the requirements that are created by the statutory authorities, the facilities owners, and the way that that work is done varies markedly. Anyone here from South Australia? No? You go to South Australia and you'll see trees growing through, canopies growing through the low voltage everywhere. There are no concerns about it growing through the low voltage. They do have concerns about it growing through the high voltage. That's very different than you'll see in Sydney, isn't it? Or Queensland. So I'm not sure why there's a strong difference, but there is. Susan's asked the question, is restorative pruning sometimes done too early after tropical cyclones? I've seen some terrible work. Yes, I think it can be done too early, Susan, but I think it's also often poorly done regardless. Why? Because we don't usually mess with trees. I was going to use the F word. One of the things that is really worthwhile having, if you can, is trees that you can mess around with. So Peter may recall this. I've got one over my property. Susan, you might recall it too. I've got a grafted Corymbia citriodora that's prostrate or weeping in its form beside the driveway. And I've pruned that and messed around with where it's growing and how it's growing by cutting back in all different ways, and just about to do the same thing again. We need trees that we can mess with to really understand them and understand what we can do. And we really can't do that with our householders' trees. So that makes it difficult. The people that really do a good job of it, Susan, bonsai. And I know Susan's a great bonsai fan. Bonsai teaches you, you can do a lot more with trees than you'd ever realize. For example, can you bonsai a eucalyptus?
Yeah.
Yes.
They do an amazing job with it. So apparently reduction pruning and root pruning are things you can do with eucalypts. So again, that experience, and you know, to a credit, I think that was one of the things that really helped Susan grasp arboriculture so well as a student, was her experience in bonsai. You realize that the rules that we keep on telling you are rules may not necessarily be rules. They may be myths. So then we go on and define some of those things. We'd say habitat value should be, I think this is crown thinning, essentially. As say, it's dead wood removal, but you know, lots of bits have been removed, and that's a pretty nice response. Most trees, what are they going to do?
Grow it back again.
Yeah, they want to grow this back again. We're going to get too much light in and stimulate new growth.
Mango trees are a good example of that. People like to cut their mango trees back and they immediately try and grow their shape back again.
So the reason they do that, Peter, is the light stimulates growth. Now, if they're an open woodland tree, light is not so critical. So there are some species that will be less problematic. The further west you get, in our end of the world, grey box, you can thin out by probably 10% and get nil response. It'll just say, hey, you want to know whether you've thinned too much? Do you get epicomic shoots develop? That's a good indicator. If you're doing it to a rainforest species or a full canopy species, that is where there's really heavy canopy below, or they grow in a heavy canopied environment, those full forest situations. So forest situations have canopy touching canopy of trees. Those trees really respond well to having stimulation from light. And so they don't do as well when it comes to thinning as those trees. For example, if you're talking about a savanna type of species, they'll tolerate a lot more thinning. And the reason why is they're used to getting light. It's there all the time and they're not full already. The percentage of crown, so we're talking about crown thinning, the percentage of crown to be removed shall be specified. The maximum diameter and the location of any branches to remove should be specified. And boy, it's hard specifying location. Let's go back up to this image. We would have to say it's the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, the sixth order first, the sixth first order branch needs to come out. But on the 5th first order branch, the 3rd order branch comes out. It would be horrible to try and specify that with words. So a photograph does well, but photographs, is anyone using photographs to show pruning?
Yes,
has
I
anyone
do.
received-
Yes. And,
Yeah, but
I
it's
marked
sometimes
them.
really hard to get the right photo because you might not be able to get access.
And even if you get the right photograph, you've done it, but when the person's looking at the photograph, they're trying to interpret that again, because remember, a photograph is a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional object. And you can sometimes still have troubles communicating with photographs. So photographs do well, but they're not necessarily the end of it all.
I think you really have to say in your report where the photograph was taken from, so that the person doing the pruning actually has to stand in the same place and look up and try and correlate the photo with the tree.
Yeah, and that again will work well with some situations, but other situations you'll still lose that 3-dimensionality of the tree, and you'll still have troubles trying to interpret. And certainly, as I've tried to mark up photographs, and those of you who are using photographs, Michele, you said you're trying to mark them up. And when you mark them up, sometimes you sit there and think, oh, how do I communicate? It's that spot that I want to cut to.
Yeah, because you're taking the photo of the spot and then you zoom in and then you lose the whole picture of the tree. So who comes along after you doesn't know what he's looking at, because the branches all look the same almost.
Yeah, it can be difficult. So specifying it and the location, my comment is that can be burdensome. In most cases, if we know why we're trying to do it, do I need to specify it?
You
Now-
may be able to require that the writer of the report author attends on site and clarifies it.
Look, I don't know what Rob prunes like. I don't even know whether Rob still climbs. But if Rob's climbing and Rob's okay, Michele, are you still climbing?
No, don't climb.
Owen, no. Anyone here climbing, you can say so. But, you know, if I was going out and I explained to the arborist what I was trying to achieve and they understood this process here, that we want smaller cuts, we want you to go out, we want you to avoid inside stuff, you don't want to clean all these out. If they understood that, then realistically, does it matter which branch is pruned if I'm taking less than 10% of the canopy out? Probably not.
Probably when the guy's up there has a bad idea what's going on, the you from down on the ground at times.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I think oftentimes if the purpose of doing the work is understood and the principles behind good pruning are understood, and I'll refer you to Ed Gilman's videos for reconstructive work. Definitely worth the look. And if you get to hear his talk on the subject, again, worthwhile seeing, you know, let them figure out what to cut. So, okay, they cut this branch here off instead of cutting that branch there off. And what's the problem there? I'm not sure that there is one. So, again, not sure. What I do think is important is to indicate what the average diameter of your pruning cut is going to be. So whilst we're given the maximum, it's good to also give an average size. So I want most of the cuts to be less than 25 mils, or I want most of the cuts to be less than 10 mils in diameter. Very big difference. Because you said average cut 10 mil, does that mean you can't make a 20 mil cut?
No.
No. So if I've said maximum cuts 50 mils and I prefer the average cut to be 20 mils, then I've said, look, you're going to have to make a lot of smaller cuts if you're going to make a few bigger cuts. And again, it gets back to trying to keep the cuts small, and that concept of the size of your average cut is likely to determine the size of a failure during a storm. Crown modification, we've already discussed that in fair detail. Again, pruning to redundancy is a way to go. You don't need to do it all now, gently and slowly, particularly when you're talking about these young trees. The pruning to do a reduction of a codominant stem by 1/3 is next to nothing. And yes, you're going to have to go back a second time, but in most cases, it's worthwhile in my mind doing things more slowly. Reduction cut, that's great. And that's really a good example. Why at a greater angle? Anyone know? The vascular tissue has to realign, and it'll actually realign from this side around here. It won't go up and then around. So it comes up at an angle, an oblique angle. And ideally, that would generally be a slightly curved cut. So I always give Sean talent heaps here. I say, Sean's the ideal guy because he can always sharpen a saw so that it cuts in a curve. I'm only joking, but it's something that we've always talked about. And, you know, this is really heavy reduction pruning. If you're talking about reduction pruning like this has reduced the load on the tree by more than 50%. It's just way too heavy in most situations because it's taken more than half the canopy out. Again, you want to do small amounts. And if you'd like to see some comparisons of reduction pruning and over the top reduction pruning, I do have some photographs of 2 figs done in a park in Sydney where the reduction pruning on one was grossly overspecified. It was on that belief that we had to take it in 1/3 to reduce the load by 1/3. The second tree, the arborist that was supervising, the consulting arborist said, you guys know what to do to it. And they just went through and cut, you know, branches of between 1 meter and 3 meters off the fig without anything being obvious, and just did a brilliant job. So again, that's that situation. Arborists that know what they're doing know what to do. Unfortunately, arborists that don't know what they're doing believe they know what they're doing and do the wrong thing. So it's that balancing act. So crown lifting, we want to specify either what branches or to what height. And one of the things that I definitely taught when I was teaching was specifying the height of the clearance can sometimes be more important, and indicating that wherever possible, achieving that by taking a number of smaller branches off is better. And frequently, just taking a few smaller branches will achieve the same result. You don't always need to take big branches out. So first order branches, sometimes second, third, and fourth order branches will achieve exactly the same clearance. The reason why you want to leave those other portions of the branches on is it ensures that you've got a tree that has as much photosynthetic material as possible. The balance between pruning and the tree is this balance of photosynthesis. We don't want to result in a loss of excess carbohydrate production. The tree's got to produce all that it needs to survive. Then we want it to store and grow. We certainly don't want to be stressing it. Pollarding, I've said we always cut back to the same spot, just to the outside of the bud. Can you pollard a deciduous tree in summer? Yes, unfortunately you can, but the best time to pollard a deciduous tree is in late autumn, early winter. I've got some Meliosetac that we pollard in the garden. I've got 2 of them, and they're always done just a week before bud burst because I'm always running late on it. I see my Pakistan mulberry come into leaf and I think, oh, I haven't pollarded. I'm evil. So, and in spite of that, those are doing well as pollards. So yes, you want to create this knuckle looking appearance. And this is nice and theoretical where you get all these nice even canes. Quite frequently, if you're talking about pollarding things like platanus, you'll have 2 or 3 canes that just take off way better than anything else, and they'll just be dominant. And then you'll get a number of smaller wispy ones. Restorative pruning, I think we're clear on that. Line clearance, we don't need to worry about. It really is outside of the scope of this standard. I will say that non-nodal cuts for line clearance is acceptable in my mind when aesthetics is not the issue and safety or risk management is the issue. So as much as I don't like the giraffe type thing, you know, the big blade that goes along and cuts, it definitely has its place. and I'm supportive of that, not against that. I don't think that society as a whole in Australia, because of the length of our transmission wires, can afford to do good quality on, which is the preferred quality of printing work everywhere. I think there are spaces where we just have to say, to have what we have without the disruption and the risk of fire, we need to do allow printing that's less than optimal in areas where aesthetics is not the issue. Palm printing. The removal of healthy fronds should be avoided as it's generally unnecessary. I agree. May place palm under stress. Probably not. What we do know is that regular pruning of palms takes away a whole pile of valuable chemicals. On a palm, that frond is a big leaf. It's a really big compound leaf. And regular pruning starts to drop phosphate, starts to drop potassium levels, can reduce the tree's growth rate. How would you deal with that? And why does it reduce it? Two good questions. Why does printing off the fronds repeatedly, green fronds, have an adverse impact on the palm's solute levels? Any idea?
Well, they're made up of all those important chemicals. So if you take them away, the tree's got to turn around and make new ones all the time. So
Is it the water intake, uptake? That
Close to it. We have in plant cells these little critters called gerontoplasts. They're a specialized plastid, and they go through and they're cleaning out all the chemicals that the plant can use and transporting it back through. And we know this happens, for example, during autumn in a deciduous tree. What happens? The color changes. It pulls apart the photosynthetic system and takes as much as it can that's able to be made soluble and brings it back into the plant as a whole. So when we prune off green leaves all the time, we do have an adverse impact. And that adverse impact may be reduced leaf size, reduced elongation, and they're not always bad. For example, if you're doing a bonsai, they're delightfully ideal end results. But how can you deal with it? One of the things that you can do to deal with it is you can simply provide supplementary fertilization. So if you're going to be pruning green fronds off regularly, that's something to think about. Now, if you're in Sydney and you're in a coastal area, Peter, you already got it way up your end of the world everywhere. There's a thing called the lesser coconut weevil, and it likes a whole pile of PDL bases. It's probably the cause of the death of the Jabea chileanensis at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Sydney. It loves PDL bases on green PDL bases. So if you're doing work in an area where lesser coconut weevil is present, do not cut green fronds unless you're going to come up with a management plan for lesser coconut weevil. It will end up destroying the palm. It starts in the PDL base, goes right through into the stem, and you end up with the entire top dropping out. And when the entire top drops out of a Phoenix canariensis and lands on the beginning, rethinking your pruning practices. And that's based on a true story out of Queensland. Now, it's interesting, climbing devices that wound the stem, such as spiked when it comes to palms, should not be used. I don't know why we got should there. I would likely say shall not be used. There's nothing worse than spiking up a palm. Some palms tolerate it really well. Cocos nacifera up your end of the world, Peter. Viagris generally. Phoenix palms don't tend to mind it. If you're talking about royal palms, Roystonia hates it, causes real problems for Roystonia. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But otherwise, they look like junkies. They do. They've got track marks all the way up them. And unlike dicotyledonous trees or gymnosperms, there's no occluding of that wound. They stay there all their life. And so just one time going up and down, in my mind, creates this horrible visual appeal that we need to deal with. And yes, a note down here, be aware, Fusarium oxysporum, is present on Phoenix, does also affect stressed Washingtonias. So be careful of that. But there are a whole pile of other diseases that are spread in palms. Pineapple wilt is another one, just a whole pile. So minimizing your harm on palms is pretty smart. Unacceptable practices, lopping and topping. Well, it's unacceptable unless you're doing restorative pruning. In that case, it may be an acceptable thing. And if it's acceptable to do that for lopping and topping, maybe there's times when you could do it. Let me give you an example where I would say lopping would be acceptable. My mother planted a tree in the front yard of a property in Castle Hill with me in 1967. They're now talking about cutting that tree down because it's got some decay in it. I say, well, hang on a second here. If we lopped it, it's a prunus. It's a wonderful flowering plum, fruiting plum, exquisite. Be almost 500 mils through in trunk diameter now. You know, could we do a pollard or a reduction print on that now? My answer is I think so. Far better than removing it. So I think there are times when non-nodal cuts are good. And it's interesting, those of you who've heard Keir Martin speak about the use of non-nodal cuts for managing of oaks at Melbourne Botanic Gardens might not feel so hostile towards it as a process, where previous pruning stripped things right back out. Doing a reduction, a non-nodal cut can end up again allowing that production of shoots in closer and start giving you something to rebuild to. Certainly if that branch broke off, we say, oh yeah, no problems, I can deal with that. So I think there is a time where non-nodal cuts do have a spot. Oh, wound painting, yep. I just talked about my mother's prunus. If I was pruning my mother's prunus back like that, or if I were to go up to my father's peach orchard when he had it and prune, we would paint to protect against silverleaf, which is a disease that attacks stems. Don't care if it gets into a branch, but I care if it gets into a stem. So if I'm making a stem cut, I would paint it. My father would say, paint everything. I hated it. But silverleaf is a disease of prunus. So there are times when you will need to do some painting. Flush cuts, I think we're pretty clear on that. I will quote an arborist who gave a little ditty for it, Christine Rampling. I'll blame her. She said, if you want to know when your pruning's good, if you're pruning, if it looks like an arse, your pruning's got class. If it looks like a gash, your pruning's got a real crass. It just says that good pruning should result in this nice round formation at the end of the cut. It shouldn't give you a U, an inverted U, a set of parentheses. They're all unacceptable end result of pruning cut. And most of those are flush. This is difficult because oftentimes when we're pruning as arborists, what we see as a branch is in fact a co-dominant stem, particularly on eucalypts. Eucalypts are prone for it. Ficus is another one. And if you look at ficus or eucalypts, sometimes you'll see that the cut dies back further in than you would think it would do, particularly on ficus. And that's one of the reasons why. So where possible, this is on root pruning, where possible roots should be pruned. A root to be pruned should be located and exposed using minimally destructive techniques such as hand digging, compressed air or water jetting, or non-destructive techniques like ground penetrating radar. It exists in the pruning standard, in the Australian Standard for Protection of Trees and Development Site. I'll deal with each of those. Water jetting. Water jetting is good so long as the pressure doesn't get above 120 psi, which means what?
You peel the bark off otherwise.
Yeah, once you get past about 130 psi, you start to do damage to the bark. And so, but no water jetting system generally runs that low. It really works well if you've got really low.
That's basically just using a garden hose.
Twice the pressure of a good garden hose. That's right. Yep. So it's not the average gurney that you get from Bunnings. If you put it face down with a nice little pointed tip, will probably be giving you too much pressure. Air is different. Compressed air comes out of a compressor is usually maxed at about 120 psi anyhow. The way that compressed air works is it accelerates the velocity. So the velocity that hits the soil is really high. It fills up small gaps and it blows it apart. Again, works really well on sandy and loamy soils. It's crap on most clays. Cragnosome clays like you've got in the northern rivers there on occasions, Peter, works well. Take it down to the puggy clays of Lismore Flats and spend all day and you'll get 25 mils of excavation. So I think it's funny that we get that process. And if you're going to go to all this trouble to find it, my answer is dig, break it. And if you really feel that you have to have a cut root, once you've broken it, then go cut it. You know where it is now. You've exposed it. The effects of root pruning are not always predictable. I'm not sure what that means. So I think it's poor in concept. We know what happens when you cut roots as much as we know what happens when you cut branches. Why?
You see the effects.
Yeah, more than that.
We do it all the time.
Yeah.
Root pruning roots.
A root below ground level, what we're talking about is a root is simply an underground branch. It's got bark on it. It's no different than a branch above ground.
Well, it is because it doesn't support load the way a branch does.
But it supports all the load that it needs to support. Exactly. So it's probably easier and less problematic cutting a root than it is cutting a branch.
Aren't roots better able to compartmentalize?
They are better. And the reason they're better able to compartmentalize apart from anything else is they have
all full of parenchyma.
Yeah, parenchyma is living, and living stuff can fight disease far better than dead. Dead does it by setting booby traps, chemical barriers. Live does it by attacking it. We don't see the defense system of a tree as being active, but it is very active. Chemically, it's quite brilliant. And then it gets in partners. So, for example, if you want to partner against Phytophthora, mycorrhizal fungi are great partners against Phytophthora, particularly the ectomycorrhizae, just low Phytophthora. Nobody likes a weak little bully. Okay, weak bullies are bullies that pick on people when no one else is watching. So Phytophthora fits into that category. So some room for notes and that's it. So that's the standard. So realistically, you should be outlining the purpose, and let me find that for you. It says it right up the front. Here, 7.1. Before the selection of a pruning class, the reason for pruning should be carefully considered. The arborist should take into account, and so on and so forth. So ideally, you would be communicating in your pruning work why you're doing it. So saying thinning tree by 1/3 is tolerable. There's concerns as a result of root pruning that the tree's biological systems may be stressed, and would rather allow the root crown ratio to develop more evenly. As a result, we want to take out 10% of the canopy. Don't know why you do it. We don't do it with transplanting nowadays. So in general, we probably shouldn't. And that's really horrible, because when I say, we probably shouldn't be doing half the pruning work we're doing, it's probably correct. Any questions on any of that? I see a question in the chat. Let me deal with that. So question Luke's asked is epishoots from light pruning a result of light and chemical changes within the leaf in areas of, or on the trunk? It's on the trunk, Luke. It's receptors on the trunk respond to getting light in, and that stimulates a meristematic trace, which is like a bud, but it's not what we used to call the meristematic buds. They're actually traces because they don't have a leaf primordia. They don't have anything to form a leaf. when they get stimulated, that process goes in. They develop this primordia, and the primordia is the printing machine that prints the new branch and the new leaf. So it's at the point it's initiated then, and it prints it like a wonderfully well-designed 3D printer. They do a brilliant job. And you can actually see, if you want to go have a look at some good scanning electron micrograph images and some good images on the internet, you'll see them in this process of printing at different stages. Or you can cut through a palm meristem and they're big, and you can see some of that process going on. So does that answer that question, Luke, hopefully? Any other questions?
Yes, thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Luke. Look, hopefully you realize that when we're writing printing specifications, we're probably doing a pretty crappy job. And certainly I know I want to say it all the time, just prune to the Australian standard. But prune to the Australian standard is not what's expected of us. It's why we're doing it, what to be done, and then specifying at least the things that they are to do and not to do. So no use of spikes on tissue to remain, some form of friction saver if they're using a double rope technique, or they're rigging through the tree. So pulley block in if you're rigging. And then I think at least communicating so that there's less misconfusion. And you know, you're always trying to get this, it's complex, and there's a point to which I say, and you know, I do recommend people to do pruning work. And usually I'll just say, look, you know, talk to either Ben or James or Sean, you know, talk to one of these guys and tell them that I only want 10% of the canopy removed, and this is what, or tell them that I just want reduction pruning because there's a massive hollow and the alternates to get rid of the tree, or whatever it might be. And I'll leave those guys to actually figure it out in most cases because I trust them. If I had to write a general set of specifications to go out to a lot of landscapers, sorry, a lot of arborists, I'd want a lot more detail. And that's one that I deal with when it comes to transplanting. I write a lot of specifications for transplanting, and I write them so that anyone can do them, not so that my team can do it, but so any team can do it. And so I want them to be detailed. And so in this situation where you know that it might go out to anybody rather than your favorite pruners, then you need to have a lot more detail. If it's your favorite pruners and you know that they're going to understand what you say, that's great. So if you're running a tight company, Owen, and you've got guys out there pruning, and you know they know what you're talking about when you say raise canopy over the roof, then great. But when you say raise canopy and you see a bunya stripped to the last 2 meters of the height of it, every other branch is gone, you know that you haven't communicated effectively. And I certainly have on many occasions specified things, and the end result that I got wasn't what I wanted. And I've even had that happen when I've been on site. When you're on site, things can often happen very quickly with a chainsaw. And the cut that you thought was going to be 150 millimeters in diameter is all of a sudden a 250 millimeter diameter cut, another 2 meters further back in towards the trunk of the tree. I think we've all experienced that, hopefully. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's specifying. The next bit is how do you audit that? And not the time for tonight. We've spent an hour and 40 minutes already, but hopefully that was of some use to you, at least sitting down and having a look at the standard. Who's had a look at it in the last 12 months?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah, I have.
Who's shocked by what's in there and what they're not doing? Me. I've taught this unit, I don't know, 6 times, 7 times, and I'm still always amazed at what you forget by not referring back to it all the time. You get into a habit of saying, I've got it covered, rather than saying, boy, I need to refer back to it, where it's not second nature to it. Whereas if I talk about the trees and development sites, I do a lot more trees and development site work, and there are big chunks of that I can quote now verbatim because I've used them so often. you know, the purpose of the role of in a major encroachment, the role of a consulting arborist is to demonstrate the tree will remain viable. So, yeah, this is a standard that almost never is used in its specification. We just say prune to. And again, if you just want to say, make sure that all final cuts are as illustrated in, I think it's image 1 and 2, image A and B, then, you know, even that's an improvement. Because you say make all cuts in accordance with the Australian standard, I've got to ask one question here, and you need to tell me, is that cut in accordance with the Australian standard?
Yeah, it is.
It is. It is. So if I don't give you enough information, you're really relying on the person understanding rather than communicating. And that means that the first person that doesn't understand it can easily get it wrong. And certainly that does happen. So guys, thanks for being here tonight. And let's next month, Peter, we're right to go again.
Yep.